A saint saw what we refuse to see. Saint Porphyrios, the Orthodox mystic who peered beyond the veil, issued a warning so disturbing that most who heard it chose denial over action. The broken home is not accidental, it is engineered. He identified the invisible architects, the subtle weapons, the coordinated assault on the family that masquerades as progress, education, and entertainment. He warned that parents sleep while their children are spiritually abducted. His final message was not comfort, but a battle plan for those brave enough to see the war. The monastery on Mount Athos stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness when St. Porphyrios first spoke the words that would haunt generations of Orthodox believers who dared to listen with open hearts and undefended minds. He was not a man given to drama or exaggeration. This gentle elder, whose hands had healed the sick, and whose prayers had moved mountains of human suffering into valleys of divine grace. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of something beyond mere opinion or theological speculation. It carried the trembling authority of a man who had seen through the fabric of time itself, who had watched the future unfold like a horror film in the theater of divine revelation. He spoke of the family, that ancient and sacred unit which had survived empires and plagues and wars beyond counting, and he declared with absolute certainty that it now faced an enemy more cunning, more patient, and more merciless than any sword or famine humanity had ever known. The modern family, he insisted, was not simply weakening through natural social evolution or the innocent passage of cultural change. It was being systematically dismantled by forces that understood exactly what they were destroying and why that destruction mattered more than any military conquest ever could. The saint's words did not emerge from paranoia or the isolated ravings of a man disconnected from the practical realities of modern life, though many would later dismiss them as exactly that, preferring the comfort of skepticism to the terror of recognition. Porphyrios had lived among people, had counseled thousands, had heard the confessions of mothers who wept over children they no longer recognized, and fathers who described feeling like strangers in their own homes. He had witnessed the acceleration, the way families that had been intact and thriving could collapse within a single generation, the bonds severing not through dramatic betrayals, but through something far more insidious, a gradual anesthesia of the soul, a slow-motion spiritual lobotomy that left family members physically present but emotionally and spiritually absent from one another. He observed patterns that others missed, connections that remained invisible to those trapped inside the machinery of modern existence. Where others saw isolated incidents of family breakdown, teenage rebellion, marital discord, and generational alienation, Porphyrios saw a coordinated campaign, a multi-front assault executed with military precision against the one institution that stood between the individual human soul and total cultural domination. The saint spoke specifically about spiritual warfare, a term that sounds medieval and superstitious to modern ears, trained to dismiss anything that cannot be measured in laboratories or peer-reviewed in academic journals. Yet Porphyrios did not speak metaphorically or symbolically. He described actual forces, intelligent and malevolent, that had identified the family as the primary obstacle to their ultimate objectives. The family, he explained, was the first church, the original school, the fundamental fortress where human beings learned love, sacrifice, faith, and the very grammar of relationship that would shape every connection they formed for the remainder of their earthly existence. Destroy the family, and you destroy the transmission belt of virtue, the generational continuity of wisdom, the organic resistance to ideological manipulation and cultural programming. The family was where children learned to distinguish truth from lies, where they developed the moral immune system that would later protect them from the infections of nihilism, materialism, hedonism, and despair. It was the training ground for spiritual warriors, and those who wage war against the human soul understood this with perfect clarity, even if the families themselves had forgotten it entirely. What made Porphyrios's warning so disturbing was not merely that he identified an enemy, but that he named the weapons and described the battlefield with such specificity that those who heard him could not pretend ignorance once the words had been spoken. He did not point to obvious villains or dramatic acts of aggression that could be easily recognized and resisted. Instead, he directed attention toward the seemingly benign, the culturally celebrated, the institutionally protected mechanisms that had been woven so thoroughly into the fabric of modern life that to question them felt like questioning oxygen itself. Media, he said, was not neutral entertainment, but a delivery system for spiritual toxins, a constant IV drip of values, assumptions, images, and narratives designed to reshape consciousness and sever the bonds between parents and children, husbands and wives, generations and their shared heritage. Education, which parents entrusted with their children's minds for the majority of their waking hours, had been transformed from a system of knowledge transmission into an indoctrination apparatus that systematically undermined parental authority, religious conviction, and traditional moral frameworks, while presenting itself as objective, scientific, and progressive. The saint's most chilling observations concerned the velocity of change, the way these destructive forces had accelerated beyond what previous generations could have imagined possible. He witnessed families who attended church regularly, who prayed together, who maintained outward forms of piety, yet whose children absorbed more hours of media messaging in a single week than they received of parental guidance in an entire month. He saw the mathematics of influence, the sheer numerical imbalance between the time children spent under the tutelage of screens and institutions versus the diminishing hours of meaningful family interaction. Parents worked longer hours to provide material comforts that required more working hours to maintain, creating a self-perpetuating cycle that systematically removed parental presence from the home, precisely during the years when children's souls were most malleable, most vulnerable, most desperate for the anchoring presence of adults who truly knew them and genuinely loved them. The enemy, Porphyrios understood, did not need to launch obvious attacks. It merely needed to create busyness, distraction, exhaustion, and the illusion that everything was basically fine even as the foundation rotted beneath the floorboards of every home. The warning carried urgency because the saint recognized that most parents remained asleep to the siege, convinced that maintaining traditional external markers, church attendance, family dinners when schedules permitted, occasional vacations together, constituted adequate defense against forces that operated at levels far beneath such surface rituals. He watched parents surrender their children's formation to institutions they would never have trusted with their wallets or their car keys, yet they handed over something infinitely more precious, the shaping of worldview, identity, moral framework, and spiritual orientation, to systems that explicitly rejected the very foundations upon which those parents claimed to build their lives. Porphyrios saw the tragedy of well-meaning families who loved their children genuinely, but who had been lulled into a false security by the gradual normalization of their own displacement, by the cultural messaging that insisted parental influence was old-fashioned, that children needed socialization more than they needed family, that expert opinion mattered more than ancestral wisdom, that progress required the destruction of everything that had come before. The saint's warning was not theoretical. It was an alarm being sounded while the house was already burning and the family still slept inside. St. Porphyrios did not traffic in vague generalities or abstract spiritual philosophies that could be safely contemplated without demanding any concrete response from those who heard them. When he spoke of the forces arrayed against the family, he identified specific mechanisms, named particular institutions, and described exact methodologies with the precision of a military analyst mapping enemy positions and supply lines. The media, he insisted, had become the most powerful catechist in human history. A religious system more effective than any church or temple had ever been precisely because it denied its own religious nature and presented itself as mere entertainment, information, or cultural reflection. Every hour spent before a screen was an hour of formation, an hour of discipleship, an hour in which values were transmitted, desires were cultivated, worldviews were constructed, and identities were shaped according to very deliberate templates that had nothing whatsoever to do with the family's stated beliefs, values, or spiritual commitments. The images that flickered across screens were not neutral. They were liturgies, carefully crafted rituals that taught children what to desire, whom to emulate, what to believe about relationships, success, happiness, beauty, and the very purpose of human existence. The saint observed how media separated family members from one another, even when they occupied the same physical space, creating what he called a spiritual solitary confinement, where each person retreated into their own screen-mediated reality, their own algorithmically curated bubble of content designed to capture attention and hold it hostage. Parents and children could sit in the same room, yet exist in completely different universes, their consciousness colonized by narratives, characters, and value systems that bore no relationship to the family's actual life, history, or spiritual tradition. Porphyrios noted the particular genius of this strategy. It required no physical coercion, no obvious violence, no dramatic confrontation that might wake people from their trance. The enemy simply offered infinite entertainment, limitless distraction, and the illusion of connection through devices that actually atomized families into isolated individuals who happened to share an address. The content itself was carefully calibrated to normalize attitudes and behaviors that previous generations would have recognized immediately as destructive. The mockery of parental authority, the celebration of rebellion as maturity, the equation of sexual license with liberation, the presentation of family bonds as oppressive constraints rather than sacred covenants, the systematic inversion of virtue and vice until children literally could not distinguish between the two. Education represented the second front in this coordinated assault, and Porphyrios spoke about it with particular grief because it involved such profound betrayal of trust. Parents sent their children into institutions believing those systems existed to serve the family's interests, to transmit knowledge and develop capability while respecting and reinforcing the moral and spiritual foundations being laid at home. Instead, the saint observed, modern education had become explicitly adversarial to family formation, operating from ideological frameworks that positioned traditional family structures, religious conviction, and parental authority as obstacles to be overcome rather than goods to be respected. The curriculum itself, Porphyrios warned, was not merely academic content, but a comprehensive worldview package designed to produce graduates who viewed their parents as ignorant, their religious traditions as superstitious, their cultural heritage as shameful, and their family bonds as accidents of biology, rather than sacred connections ordained by divine intention. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year, children absorbed messages about autonomy, trumping obedience, personal authenticity, superseding familial obligation, individual rights eclipsing communal responsibility, and self-determination overruling any external moral authority, including that of parents and God. The saint identified something that academic researchers and cultural critics had missed or deliberately ignored: the way these institutional forces worked synergistically, each reinforcing and amplifying the effects of the others. Media normalized behaviors and attitudes that education then legitimized with academic authority and institutional prestige. Peer culture, cultivated intensively through both media exposure and institutional socialization, created a third layer of pressure that made it nearly impossible for children to resist the coordinated messaging, even when parents attempted to provide alternative formation. Porphyrios watched children who had been raised in devout homes, who had received every advantage of religious education and family stability, nevertheless abandon their faith and their families within months of entering educational institutions or fully immersing in media-saturated peer cultures. He saw the pattern repeat itself with such consistency that he could predict outcomes based solely on the degree of exposure to these institutional forces, regardless of how strong the family appeared on the surface or how sincere the parents' religious commitment seemed to be. What made this spiritual warfare so devastatingly effective, the saint explained, was its operation beneath the level of conscious awareness, working through the manipulation of desire rather than the presentation of argument. The enemy understood that human beings are far more motivated by what they want than by what they think is true, that shaping desire is infinitely more powerful than winning intellectual debates. Media and education did not primarily attack family values through direct logical refutation. Instead, they made family life appear boring, constraining, and oppressive, while making the alternatives seem exciting, liberating, and fulfilling. They cultivated desires for experiences, relationships, and lifestyles that were fundamentally incompatible with family formation and maintenance, then presented the resulting family breakdown not as loss but as the price of authentic living, as necessary sacrifice on the altar of personal growth and self-actualization. Children absorbed the message that family was something to escape from, that parental guidance was something to outgrow, that tradition was a cage rather than a heritage, and that their highest obligation was not to honor the bonds that formed them, but to discover and express whatever passing emotional state they currently identified as their true self. Porphyrios reserved his most urgent warnings for the speed with which this destruction was accelerating, and the near-total inability of families to recognize what was happening until irreversible damage had already occurred. He described talking with parents who were genuinely shocked to discover that their teenage children held beliefs and values completely antithetical to everything the family claimed to stand for. Parents who could not understand how such dramatic divergence had occurred despite their efforts at religious education and moral formation. The saint would gently point out the mathematics they had failed to calculate: the 30 hours per week of media consumption, the 40 hours per week in educational institutions, the constant digital connectivity to peer networks, all of it adding up to an overwhelming tide of formation in one direction, versus the few scattered hours of direct parental influence attempting to swim against that tide. The enemy had built a system where parents fought with slingshots against institutional artillery, where families resisted with occasional conversations against the constant bombardment of professionally produced content designed by experts in psychological manipulation to capture and reshape consciousness. The war was real, the weapons were identified, the casualties were mounting. Yet most families continued to act as though peace reigned, and the only danger was being too strict, too religious, too protective, or too disconnected from the cultural mainstream that was actively working to destroy them. St. Porphyrios did not issue his warnings as an exercise in despair or fatalistic resignation to inevitable defeat, though the forces he identified were formidable enough to justify such darkness. Instead, he spoke with the urgency of a general who sees the enemy's strategy clearly and knows that victory remains possible for those willing to fight with intelligence, commitment, and the spiritual weapons that actually correspond to the nature of the battle being waged. The family fortress he described was not a physical structure but a spiritual architecture built from intentional choices, radical prioritization, and the ruthless elimination of everything that weakened the bonds between parents and children, husbands and wives, generations and their sacred heritage. This fortress required sacrifice, not the empty symbolic sacrifices of religious ritual performed without understanding, but the concrete sacrifices of time, career advancement, social status, material comfort, and the cultural approval that modern people crave more desperately than previous generations ever craved bread or water. Porphyrios insisted that families must become what the surrounding culture would inevitably label as extreme, radical, countercultural, and even dangerous, because anything less than total commitment to family formation would be systematically overwhelmed by the institutional forces designed to destroy it. The foundation of this spiritual fortress, the saint taught, was the absolute reclamation of time and presence from the institutions and technologies that had colonized them. This meant decisions that would mark families as strange in the eyes of neighbors, relatives, and even fellow believers who had made their peace with the cultural mainstream and could not understand why such dramatic measures might be necessary. Porphyrios advocated for the severe limitation or complete elimination of media consumption, not as legalistic rule-following, but as strategic recognition that you cannot simultaneously drink poison and expect to remain healthy regardless of how small the doses or how carefully you monitor the intake. He watched families who attempted to moderate, to find balance to allow controlled exposure, and he observed that these middle-path approaches almost universally failed because they underestimated the addictive properties of media, the sophisticated manipulation embedded in content, and the reality that children and adults alike lacked the spiritual immune systems necessary to process the toxins being introduced. The fortress required walls, and walls by definition exclude. They say no to some things, so that other more precious things can be protected and cultivated inside. Education represented perhaps the most difficult and costly element of fortress building, because it required families to take full responsibility for something that modern society had long since outsourced to institutional experts and professional systems. St. Porphyrios spoke about education with a clarity that terrified those parents who actually heard what he was saying. He insisted that the spiritual and moral formation of children could not be safely delegated to any institution that did not share the family's foundational commitments, that parents who sent their children into hostile ideological environments for 30 or 40 hours per week were functionally surrendering those children regardless of whatever countermeasures they attempted during the limited hours that remained. This did not necessarily mean homeschooling for every family, though the saint certainly saw that as the gold standard for those capable of it. But it absolutely meant the recognition that education was not neutral, that schools were not simply buildings where information was transmitted, but were comprehensive formation systems that shaped souls according to very specific templates. Parents building fortresses, Porphyrios taught, had to become the primary educators of their children, even if schools were used for certain academic functions, had to maintain absolute vigilance about curriculum content and institutional values, and had to be willing to remove children immediately from any environment that proved actively hostile to family formation and spiritual health. The interior life of the fortress required the cultivation of practices and rhythms that systematically strengthened family bonds while developing the spiritual resilience necessary to resist external pressures. Porphyrios emphasized prayer not as individual pietism, but as family practice, the daily gathering of the entire household before God in shared vulnerability, shared dependence, and shared communion with the divine source of all love and strength. He taught that families must eat together daily, not as mere routine, but as sacred ritual, as the deliberate choosing to be present to one another rather than scattered to individual pursuits and digital distractions. The saint insisted on the importance of storytelling, the transmission of family history and religious heritage through narrative that connected children to something larger than themselves, that gave them identity rooted in continuity rather than the fragmented ahistorical selfhood that modern culture offered as liberation. He spoke about work done together, projects completed as family units, the development of competence and capability through shared effort that built both skill and relational intimacy in ways that no amount of quality time or scheduled activities could replicate. St. Porphyrios understood that the fortress would face constant pressure from multiple directions, the judgment and incomprehension of extended family members who viewed such radical choices as excessive or even abusive, the social isolation that came from refusing to participate in cultural norms that everyone else accepted without question, the economic costs of prioritizing family presence over career advancement and material accumulation, the exhaustion of maintaining boundaries in a world that systematically worked to erode them. He knew that parents would doubt themselves constantly, would wonder whether they were harming their children by making them different, would fear that protection might become overprotection and that fortress walls might become prison walls. The saint counseled that these doubts were part of the warfare itself, psychological operations designed to undermine resolve and create the openings through which the enemy could infiltrate. He insisted that parents must cultivate certainty about what mattered most, must anchor themselves in the recognition that their children's souls were worth any social awkwardness, any financial limitation, any personal sacrifice that genuine protection required. The fortress was not built from paranoia, but from love, the fierce, uncompromising love that recognized threats clearly and responded with proportional defensive measures. The radical nature of what Porphyrios advocated became fully apparent only when parents actually attempted to implement his vision and discovered how thoroughly their own consciousness had been colonized by the very forces he warned against. They found themselves instinctively resisting the sacrifices he prescribed, found countless rational justifications for why such extreme measures were unnecessary in their particular circumstances, found themselves more afraid of their children being socially awkward or academically behind than of those same children losing their faith and abandoning their families. The saint anticipated this resistance and addressed it directly. He explained that the spiritual warfare against the family had been so successful precisely because it had captured not just institutions, but consciousness itself, had made the defense of family appear fanatical, while the surrender of family appeared moderate and reasonable. Parents who wanted to build the fortress would have to engage in what amounted to deprogramming, would have to systematically identify and root out the assumptions, values, and priorities that they had absorbed from the very culture that was destroying them. This was painful work, humiliating work that required admitting how thoroughly they had been compromised and how much of what they considered normal was actually collaboration with the enemy. St. Porphyrios closed his warnings with words that combined hope and sobriety in equal measure. He promised that families who built the fortress, who made the radical choices and sustained them through years of pressure and doubt, would discover something that the surrounding culture had forgotten was even possible: the joy of deep belonging, the security of unbreakable bonds, the richness of lives lived in genuine communion rather than isolated autonomy, the transmission of faith and wisdom across generations in ways that produced not rebels against family, but defenders of it. Not individuals desperate to escape, but adults grateful for the heritage they received and determined to pass it forward. These families would become visible testimonies to an alternative way of living, would demonstrate that the fortress was not a prison, but a sanctuary, that the walls that excluded poison also preserved health, that the sacrifices demanded by love were infinitely less costly than the emptiness produced by capitulation to cultural norms. The broken home, Porphyrios insisted, was not inevitable. It was a choice made daily through 1,000 small surrenders to forces that promised convenience and delivered destruction. The intact home was equally a choice, made daily through 1,000 small acts of resistance, protection, and the cultivation of sacred space where souls could form properly, where children could become fully human, where the family could fulfill its eternal purpose as the first church, the domestic monastery, the irreplaceable fortress where heaven and earth met, in the ordinary miracle of people who chose to love one another, despite everything the world did to prevent it.